So I'm here to welcome Ian MacRae from London, England, to talk about the dark and bright side of personality. And really excited to have Ian talk to you about his experiences through writing the book, through developing the assessment tools. So those of you who are really interested in psychometrics, Ian developed and designed those tools so we can get inside his head a little bit to talk about what that looks like. And then how we can take some of the learnings from the work he's doing in terms of our own leadership development and growth. And so this is going to be really interactive. All the slides are on Moodle for you, so you can follow along his slides. You're going to have a chance to dig into your report. Lots of chance to ask Ian questions. We'll take a break, probably about an hour and quarter in after HPTI. We'll take a 5-minute stretch break. We'll then dive into the dark side.
Yep.
We'll have lots of time for questions. And then after Ian wraps up, after about 2 hours, we'll take a 15-minute class break before we get into the rest of the class. So please help me welcome, from London, England, Ian MacRae.
Thanks. I did actually go to KSS, but I haven't lived here for quite a long time now. But yeah, I'm going to talk about the bright and the dark side of leadership, potential, and personality. I'm splitting it up, and we're going to do the bright side first and then the dark side later. I hope most of you have done the tests that have been sent out. If you haven't, you still can do them after class, so you can get them later. Have a look if you're interested in doing that. This can be quite interactive, so if you have questions, comments, feel free to put up your hand, ask a question throughout. I'm going to take a couple breaks too. But yeah, I want to talk about your results and how they relate to personality and potential, especially in the workplace. And I did develop the assessments, so the HPTI has probably been used by about 100,000 people now around the world. It's in a couple dozen different languages. So if you're interested in the process of developing it, how we ask the questions, why we ask the questions, how the reports get developed, I'll talk about that a bit, but if you have specific questions, I'm sure I can answer those too. I did just release this book, Dark Social, but I've released more. Some of them are in the library. This one, there's a digital copy if you want. I think you have handouts from a couple of the chapters, but it talks a lot about the dark side of personality, how we measure it, why we measure it, specific to the workplace and in a digital environment. The book kind of started out as a psychology of digital communication, but the publishers wanted a good hook, so we call it Dark Social, and we talked about the dark side of personality at work, and made it more about digital communication and online, which was great timing for the last year to talk about how the dark side of personality and behavior exists online and digital spaces as well as in physical spaces. So there's that, a few translations of these. My background is in psychology, but in very practical, applied psychology. So I've always worked in business or organizational psychology. I did my undergrad dissertation partially at KGH, actually, looking at the communication networks of teams, multidisciplinary teams, interested in how that's related to engagement, performance, and communication networks. And then I went to London, University College London, and developed the HPTI. That was the kind of first steps of that were my master's dissertation. And then ended up expanding it, testing it a lot, sold it to a test publishing company a couple of years ago, finally sold the rest of it to a test publishing company a couple of years ago. So this talks about the psychology of social media, digital communication, specifically understanding the dark side of personality at work. I've read the chapters about the dark side of personality at work and got your assessments. But we'll start off with the bright side and talk about potential. And the first topic I want to cover is specifically looking at the psychology of potential. And what do we mean when we talk about workplace potential? Because it's really important when you're looking at potential that you ask the question, potential to do what at work, right? Because often we hear someone's high potential or they're ambitious or, they're going places, but what does it necessarily mean? There's a kind of traditional career path associated with high potential. Sometimes it's associated with leadership, right? So there's that kind of one path of potential that you can look at of getting kind of senior leadership and going up that career ladder in one particular position. But there's all sorts of other jobs. There's all sorts of other successful jobs. There's all sorts of other jobs that people want to do that are useful and effective. And leadership is a very niche career path, really. So you can look at potential in the context of leadership if you're looking at what are the specific abilities, traits, components of leadership. But if you're looking at other jobs, you want to look at other types of potential and then what predicts that. So what personality traits make a good leader are very different than what make a good salesperson or innovator or communicator or all sorts of other jobs. So you need to look at the different traits in relation to what you want to achieve and specifically what type of potential you want to look at. So potential is also a probability. You know, if we say someone's high potential based on these traits, we need to say high potential to do what, and a probability. It's not necessarily a guarantee. We can say, oh, this person is likely to succeed in this area, but we're not necessarily saying 100% they're going to succeed because we've measured their personality traits. The capacity for achieving success in a clearly defined area. So this goes back to the psychology and the science of personality, is the more clearly you define success, the easier it is to measure the things that predict that success. So you can say, okay, we know this is exactly the type of behavior, outcome, success we're looking for. Now we can work backwards and say, what predicts that? And then you can get the evidence to say, these traits predict success, or these behaviors predict success, these motivational factors predict success. And the more you can get those clearly defined, the better able you are to predict them, in a sense of probability. And realization of that which is possible, so that means potential is the future. We don't necessarily know that's guaranteed, but it's a probability. You know, past performance is different than future potential. Past performance is a fairly good indicator of future potential, future behavior, but it's not 100%, right? You can take someone in one environment who's very successful at one thing, put them in a completely different environment, completely different situation, different team, different factors, different challenges, different demands, and you don't necessarily know they're going to be high potential or successful in that position. So that's why you can look at the psychological factors that are, you know, continuous, stable, and predictive of success. So here's some of the factors of potential, right? We're mostly going to look at personality, but motivation is really important for success and potential. You know, you could say this person has a high probability of success, but do they actually want to do it? If they're not interested, they're not motivated, they're not focused, then maybe they will never realize that potential. Intelligence is important, and in psychology, for intelligence, we mean essentially ability to learn from new information and adapt to your environment. So that is a really useful trait in most types of work in leadership. It combines with personality in that sense of potential. Skills, environment, those are all the factors that you can learn, develop, train, change, whatever. But personality is about 20 to 30% of potential. So when we look at the psychological research, about 20 to 30% of that predicts it. So it's useful. 20 to 30% is a really good psychological factor. It's a really useful indicator in any sort of behavioral science, but it's not 100%. Right? We can't take your HBTI report and say, okay, 100% I can predict how successful you're going to be in anything. It's a lot better than 0. It's a lot better than 5 or 10%, but it's only that one part of it. And then we can look at that even further to look at the dark side and the bright side. So we can look at success potential or derailment potential. What's the probability? What's the likelihood that someone's going to succeed in this area? What's the probability of the potential that they are going to absolutely destroy this company if we put them in charge? Or they're going to fail in this line of work? Or they're going to really struggle? But then you can look at the factors that contribute to derailment potential and say, okay, what kind of guardrails can we put in place to make sure that doesn't happen? What does this person need to learn to be successful in this job, in this role, in this environment? So what often happens in selection and choosing people for jobs is you look at those success potential and you say, here's the 5 characteristics we want from someone. We want to hire, high potential based on this personality trait, based on this skill, based on this level of intelligence. But sometimes when you forget the derailment potential, you forget all of the stuff that can go wrong. And so if you don't build those structures and tools and put them in place for derailment potential and prevent that, then you can forget about all of the stuff that can go wrong, which you need to make sure that someone can be more successful. So there's a really good model from Silzer and Church, I'm going to go forward and back, about how to look at potential and the specific dimensions of potential that you can use to break it down. So there's 3 dimensions here that we can look at in different kind of components of what makes someone successful. So those foundational dimensions, I'm going to go backwards, are the core, consistent, stable things that predict potential almost universally in any job. So any guesses what those might be? Personality can be one because it's very stable and it's very consistent across time. So if we're looking at these foundational dimensions that help you in any job, in any career, in any business, then those are those foundational ones that are useful universally. Like any examples of what pretty much every employer would say they are looking for in a job? Being a self-starter, yeah?
Soft skills.
Soft skills, yeah? Like communication skills?
Yeah.
Or
so how do you deal with people?
Yep.
With the technique, sometimes this kind of technique not teach in school, but you have to learn it in life.
Yeah, exactly. So those could be really useful. And yeah, to be able to talk with other people and have those communication skills can be really useful, generally applicable. Yeah?
I would say motivation.
Yeah, so what kind of motivation?
Internal motivation, just like actual drive to get the tasks done.
Yeah, intrinsic motivation, right? Yeah, so that's exactly. So you might say you want someone who's a self-starter. They can motivate themselves instead of constantly having to be motivated by the manager. That can be really important. And yeah, so you want those stable traits. That can be sometimes more of a growth dimension. So growth dimensions are what help people learn, evolve, and change. So those are things that if you're putting someone in training, you want someone with high growth dimensions of potential, that they're actually going to learn from the training, they're going to benefit from the training, that they're motivated to learn. So that can be a bit more variable. And then there's career dimensions, which are really specific and focused to a particular job or line of work. So if you're a mechanic, you need mechanical skills, but it doesn't necessarily transfer to other types of work. It might help you to understand other people, but if you're in a leadership position, being able to fix a car or a tractor isn't going to help you specifically with that type of work. If you're leading a group of people, then it could help in that specific area. But you can break these down into those three general areas. And it's a good framework because then if you're hiring someone, you can say, what are the foundational dimensions that we absolutely need and we cannot train for? So we need to make sure people have this starting on the job. And then you can say, what are the growth dimensions? So are we going to train people? Is there a long-term development plan? And what are the factors that are going to contribute to that training and that success in work? And then the career dimensions are, what do you need for this exact job right now? And then the question is, do you want to hire for that or can you train for it? Do you want to hire someone who can start work immediately? They've got those foundational core dimensions that are important, but they could start work and work with clients or do the job or do whatever they need to do right now today. Or are you hiring for high potential? You know they've got those kind of core fundamental skill or traits and kind of qualities, but you can train them for management skills. You can train some of those soft skills. You can train for leadership capacity. So it's a really interesting discussion that happens is, do you want to hire someone who is a fully formed employee who can do the job immediately with little supervision, or are you hiring long-term potential? Do you want to hire someone who you can train and embed in the work and give experience? And it's an interesting discussion because often when you hire people who are ready to go on the job immediately, they're also the most flexible people who could find different types of work and might be less motivated to stay, and you've invested less in them, so they're more likely to try and find other work if they're not getting what they want on the job. But then the more you invest in people and help them improve their skills, capabilities, abilities on the job, and understand that workplace and develop those career dimensions, often they tend to be more loyal employees. They tend to stay longer because you've invested in them, so they have more organizational commitment and focus on that company. So you can look at these in those three ways. The foundational elements are especially personality intelligence. And the reason for that is they don't change a lot over time, so they're not highly variable. Now that's not exclusively true with younger people, so we find personality traits stabilize between about 20 to 30. So if you're on the younger end of that spectrum, you've taken the HBTI, there might be some change that still happens in personality. We can't really test people who are 10 or 12 very well in personality because it changes so much. We can't reliably predict someone's personality traits over time at that age. But we can test someone at about 30 years old, and their personality traits are going to be very, very similar when they're 60. And that research has been done over decades and decades and decades in different countries and different continents and all over the place. We know that when you test the kind of fundamental personality factors, they're not highly changeable. So that's really useful for understanding potential because you can say these are some of the factors that we know aren't going to change. I'm going to talk about what those are. So I've kind of talked about that already, but these are the fundamental questions. Potential to do what? So if you're looking at a clearly defined area of potential, is it leadership? Is it technical ability? Are you looking at sales, innovation, product development, team building? So in your reports, you've got a kind of benchmark of leadership. I wouldn't take those too much as kind of predictors of your own specific potential, because those benchmarks are based on senior country level heads of leadership in kind of multinational companies. So we're talking like head of country, head of continent for a pharmaceutical company or a bank or something. So that's a really specific profile that we've taken there, those optimal ranges of saying we've got these head of country level people in multinational companies, what are their personality profiles? And so that's what those optimal traits are on your HBTI reports. So if that's exactly what you want to do, then you might say, okay, these are the kind of high potential traits for those skills. If you've got other ambitions, other goals, looking at other types of work, then those specific benchmarks are much less important. And also, as personality is still not necessarily stable. If you're really early in your career, then that's something to think about too, because generally personality tends to get a bit more adaptive over the lifespan. So people tend to get a bit more conscientious, they tend to get a bit more well-adjusted, better able to deal with stress and kind of difficult situations just from experience. That's a kind of well-documented psychological finding. So we need those specific success criteria, measurable, specific, and clear criteria about what makes success before we can predict it. So I'm going to talk about the traits. Again, I kind of said this. Personality, we can define personality as consistent and stable patterns of thinking, acting, and behaving. So this affects everything because it affects how you relate to other people. So it affects how you're thinking about other people, your relationships at work, and that behavior that comes from that and how you react based on that. Tends to be stable throughout the adult lifespan. 20 can still be a bit variable, but as you get to 30, 40, it's getting a lot more stable. And it can be predictive of long-term outcomes. So there's been a lot of research on both, health outcomes, but on work outcomes as well. So we know it can be highly predictive of those. That. I'm going to come back to this later, but then we can look at the dark and the bright side of personality. So everything exists on a spectrum. I like this one, sorry. When we're talking about the dark and bright side. So when we're looking at high and low levels of personality trait, it's not always so much we're looking at good or the bad, but we're looking at the positive and negatives that come from that. So there's all sorts of personality traits that can be really useful in a particular situation, but can be counterproductive or even destructive in other positions. So what makes a really good leader, if you take someone in that position and put them in a radically different job, they might actually do terribly. So it's not necessarily that their personality traits are always useful for everything, but we need to look at the dark side of it as well. So that's what the second test you take is going to look at. And we can look at it in ways that are like counterproductive reactions to stress. Some ways that people deal with stress, coping mechanisms can be really healthy in one environment, one workplace, but really, really destructive with other people in different environments. I'll mention that. But when we're looking at the dark side of personality too, the best way to define that is really rigid, stable, but counterproductive or destructive patterns of behavior that are difficult to change, right? Because some things are relatively easy to change, but when you have those long-term patterns over someone's life that are really difficult to change, ways that are problematic for dealing with stress or other people or interpersonal challenges, then we can look at ways that might go wrong and that derail the potential. So that's an important question about, is it the wrong behavior or the wrong situation or a combination of the two? How much is it that person or the wrong environment or that person in the wrong environment at the wrong time?
Can I just clarify there, you said we become more adaptable when we're older. So do we become more entrenched in our personality and and more rigid? Or is there any evidence around that piece around the longer you're in the workplace or whatever that you're less likely to change? Or do we understand ourselves better and we're more adaptable to that?
Yeah, more adaptive. So as we get older, we figure out better ways of dealing with stress.
Okay.
And so those personality traits tend to shift a little bit just towards being more adaptive, kind of useful, helpful, right? So you get a bit more organized, a bit better at dealing with stress, and they tend to go in a useful position for most people. The other thing that some psychologists have found, and this is generally consistent, is that traits tend to get a bit more extreme over time. And there's kind of a feedback mechanism. So if you're really interested in new information, you've got that high kind of curiosity, openness, then you tend to seek out situations where you learn more new things. And then you get positive feedback for that, if that tends to be useful. So because you've learned new things, you get new opportunities, and then there's kind of a constant feedback cycle there. It doesn't change that much, though. We're not looking at radical shifts. We're looking at kind of small percentage point changes, like 1, 2, 3 points over, a few years. So without like really serious psychological intervention or with really serious kind of coordinated long-term attempts to change, personality change is really, really challenging. And there's a few exceptions to that, like head injuries and stuff, but yeah.
Is personality more like genetics or your upbringing?
Well, that's a good question. That's hotly debated. It's about 50-50. So the research that's been done on twin studies, for example, is a really good way of researching whether something's genetic or environmental. Finds about 50-50. Some studies are more like 40-60, but when you take meta-analyses of all of the studies, it's about half and half. And then there's some things about how personality develops initially, about kind of parental environments and children and how those interact and how the genetic components interact throughout the lifespan. But yeah, about half. Yeah.
What's been found about pet trauma?
Yeah, so that's something that can radically change personality. Just because personality is something that we can look at the neurological correlates of, so there are specific parts of the brain and specific processes in the brain that are related to certain personality traits, especially in the kind of prefrontal cortex in the front of the head. So really severe head trauma can change those patterns and in unpredictable ways. So it depends on kind of where the connections are shifting or what's damaged. But yeah, that kind of really serious damage can cause changes. But it's not fully understood how that happens. Yeah.
May I ask whether the brain is really can be wiring? You know, say that the brain damage, is it any possibility to fix it?
To a certain degree, yes. Yeah, that's a good question because the brain is very plastic, which is what psychologists say to mean it's variable. So the brain can fix itself amazingly well, and it has all sorts of mechanisms for that. So if a bit of the brain is damaged, often it can find new pathways and new connections to try and do what it was trying to do before. It's not 100%. Some damage is really, really difficult to reverse. But it can, basically your brain is kind of constantly trying to adapt itself in the connections and the pathways and the neurons to be able to accomplish whatever you're trying to do. So even things like after people have a stroke, right? If it's, moving your hand or moving your arm, you can start off where it's really, really, really challenging, but by really conscious, deliberate work, you can make those pathways rewire a bit to, have that either mobility, and it's the same with kind of cognitive mobility or personality, is you can repair that damage to a certain extent, but you can't necessarily fix it 100%.
Is it full surgery or how to do the rewiring?
You could do that, like your brain is rewiring itself constantly based on what you do. So if you're if it's physical therapy, if you're moving your hand and moving your arm, those same pathways and those connections in your brain are trying to rewire themselves to help the neurons all the way down your arm to be able to do that. And the same is true with your behavior. So if you do something really constantly, really consistently, over and over, your brain is adapting to that. It's like driving. When you start off driving and it's really tough and you have to think about shifting gears, or maybe not, but what signal lights or whatever you're trying to do in driving, you have to think about everything deliberately, and your brain is really consciously trying to form those connections. But after a while, those connections get more automatic, they get more kind of embedded, entrenched. So your brain is rewiring itself to make you a better driver. And so it becomes almost unconscious and practiced. And the same is true with everything at work. If you're practicing a skill, you might start off really, really struggling with it. And it takes a while to master it. And you have to practice it again and again and again. Or if you're learning something, you learn more about it and practice it again. And your brain is rewiring itself to make those connections faster, easier, and more efficient. So the next time you do it, it's a little bit easier. So you can train yourself motivationally in the same way you might be able to do with kind of physical therapy to get those kind of brain connections really well wired together and efficient.
That means you force your brain to do something. Say, for example, the brain, I don't know where, is it have a small portion, kind of information retention part, but in case that part damaged, is there any possibility to fix it, or?
Sometimes, the hippocampus is where a lot of memory is. It's kind of right in the middle there. And yes, so you can do some work. You can't always recover stuff, but you can train it to do new stuff in different ways. So that's, whenever you're doing something, whenever you're practicing something, whatever you're learning, you are rewiring your brain a bit. Which is why when we're talking about this and high potential, is why you want to be thinking about what skills you want to practice, what skills you want to learn, and what kind of behaviors you want to be doing over and over, because your brain is rewiring itself to make that more natural. Yeah.
Is there a way, other than nootropic use and other sort of medications, to improve the way your brain creates patterns and rewires itself, essentially? Because if certain people are at different rates, is there a way to enhance the way that your brain actually makes those neural connections and creates those new neural pathways?
That's a good question. To some degree. I mean, even some things like having good cardiovascular health and exercising makes your brain more efficient at kind of changing those connections and rerouting. So physical health is sometimes a good correlate of that. Specifically, other than repeated practice and effort, there's not a lot of shortcuts. People have been trying to find those shortcuts for a really long time for how to make memory easier, retention. Yeah,
because some people just have naturally better retention and can learn things much quicker than other people. So is that something that you've looked into? Or?
Yeah, so some of that is biological. Some people have naturally more efficient ways of processing in the brain. That's part of what comes into intelligence, is some people just process those things quicker. Some people need a little more time and to take a little more effort and energy to really retain information and to focus on things or to practice stuff. Some people's brains are just slightly more efficient at that. But again, that's looking at, we can bring this right back to that. That's why kind of long-term development, one of the things you want to look at is those really clear long-term embedded personality pathways versus what you can learn. So when we're looking at potential, the other thing we can do is look at practicing and adding skills and developing skills and changing all of those things that are more fluid or less stable. But these ones, and these are essentially in order of how stable they are. So conscientiousness tends to be the most stable personality trait that is most predictive of high potential performance at work. And it tends to be the most kind of entrenched one. And it tends to be the most foundational element of potential, partly because it's stable, so we can predict conscientiousness over time. People who are really well organized, really focused, really good at self-motivation tend to be like that in the long term. It can shift a bit, but that's a really good indicator of potential at work. Same with adjustment, that's about stress responses. So some people are naturally wired to be a bit more sensitive to stress. Some people feel more stressed more easily, more intensely, and a lot of that's to do with kind of that early wiring and how it's developed and how people have learned stress responses. So adjustment is really interesting at work too, because how kind of resilient or sensitive are you to stress in the workplace? And when we look at really senior levels of leadership, for example, those higher level adjustments are sometimes necessary. Because if you're in a really senior, difficult, challenging position with a lot of responsibility, a lot of your own stress, and a lot of other people's stress that comes to you, then you need some capacity to deal with that. Now, again, there's components of this adjustment that are kind of hardwired, but there's all sorts of things you can do to manage stress and deal with stress, right? There's all sorts of strategies that you can develop, both with self-awareness and managing stress in your environment, to figure out, okay, how do I deal with difficult situations at work? What do I find most challenging? Is it interpersonal conflict? Is it deadlines? Is it learning new things? And then figure out ways that you can deal with that stress and accommodate it. But adjustment tends to be predictive of performance, especially the more stressful the job is. So people who are naturally more resilient to that stress tend to be a bit more high performing in the long term. Again, we're talking small percentages, so it is useful, it's helpful, we can predict some amount of potential with it, but it's not 100%, and there's also stuff you can develop. Curiosity is about learning new information and approach to information. Some people tend to be a lot more just generally curious about everything around them and want to learn lots of new information and want to learn all the techniques and want to learn all the kind of depth and nuance to stuff and like to be continually learning. And some people like to be more consistent and stable. And there's a lot of jobs where that's really useful to have someone who is a very predictable, stable, continuous performer. We know exactly how they're going to do their job. They're not necessarily the most innovative person, but they're really reliable. So when we look at kind of potential and potential to do what, that's one of the examples of when, high curiosity in an innovative field might be really useful. But if we're looking at lower curiosity in a kind of technical position or something, it might be really useful to have a really stable, consistent performer, and we don't want someone who's trying new stuff all the time because that's not the best use of their time. Risk approach is another one. This one's sort of related to stress, but it's really about being proactive or reactive in response to stress. And we can see this as a personality pattern, is do people deal with conflict head on? Are they okay to just have difficult conversations or take risks or try things in their job? And is it really stressful, or do they kind of naturally just dive in? Or, on the other hand, do they tend to be more reactive? Do they avoid conflict a bit? Do they wait it out and see what happens? It's kind of more of a fight or flight response. So instead of actively, kind of proactively dealing with something, do they wait until it's so bad that they have to deal with it? And it depends on the job you're in. So some jobs take a lot of risks. One of the reasons it's called this specifically is because I've done a lot of work in the financial sector, and they really, really have a different approach to risk sometimes and risk management, and should people be taking risks and how much does that affect their career and their job and their performance when it's tied to risk taking versus reward. Whereas you have some jobs where you don't want people to be taking highly risky behavior, you don't want people to be really confrontational, you don't want people to be taking risks with the job or with the company or with other people's money necessarily. So when you look at that ability, that capacity to confront versus avoid risk and how people are approaching that at work, it tends to be really useful for understanding potential, but more nuanced in what the job is and what the specific task is in their work, whereas conscientiousness tends to be more predictive of foundational success. Then the last two, ambiguity acceptance, is about complexity. So curiosity is about novelty, so new things, and then ambiguity is about complexity. So are you happy working with a whole bunch of people with a whole bunch of different ideas and figuring out what the best one is? Or do you like to have one answer? Do you like to have one specific, clear instruction, outcome, answer, or do you want to know all of the nuance behind it? And again, this is one that the right level of that trait really depends on the work you're trying to do. In leadership, understanding and managing ambiguity is essential, but in a lot of jobs, clarity are really important too. So if you're looking at what the job description is, then that's kind of depends on whether ambiguity acceptance is really useful and necessary, or it might hinder you a bit. And then competitiveness is usually pretty straightforward, but we've kind of got a collaborative versus a competitive orientation. And that, when that is kind of useful, high potential, competitive is really good for solo pursuits. So we see salespeople usually have the highest competitiveness levels and they tend to be really successful because it's about sole performance. In the kind of sports terminology too, we can look at kind of individual performance versus team performance. So how much are you trying to perform for yourself, for your own score, your own points, what you're trying to do in your own performance versus team performance? Because sometimes people who are highly competitive really struggle to kind of sublimate their goals, their objectives towards team performance when they're not recognized as the kind of highest achiever. So understanding how that works in teams is really, really useful for understanding whether it's leadership or what type of performance it is. I've talked to a lot of leaders who really, really struggle with this initially when they go from really high-performing roles to leadership roles because they're used to being the top performer in their team. That's what they got recognized for. That's what they got promoted for. That's why they're in their leadership position. But all of a sudden, they're managing other people who are doing that job and whose performance is being monitored, and they're managing that. And instead of getting the credit necessarily for their performance, they need to recognize the team performance and figure out how to reward people without it being threatening or worrying or concerning to them and their performance. Usually with some coaching and development and practice and learning other skills, a lot of people can make that transition, but it's something that's a struggle for some people when they're really used to being solo performers and then having to be team performers, especially when it's recognizing other people's contributions instead of necessarily being the kind of sole performer.
You can see entrepreneurs, right?
Yeah.
Competitive, but then if their company grows, like not everybody is, they're good in the startup and but then if they're managing a company.
Yeah, exactly.
It's not always maybe where their best strength is.
And that's one of the challenges that entrepreneurs always have too, is it's a very, very, very different business when you're starting up a small company and you're looking at really specific metrics of financial performance or team performance or, what investors are looking for, what metrics they're looking for versus growing a company and then having to take a bit of a back seat, figuring out what the role is different, and then even recognizing other people as the main contributors to the bigger growing company instead of being the kind of star of the company, because the problem is sometimes it's demotivating for people when they've got this kind of godhead figurehead of the company who wants to be growing in the front of the organization. That's not necessarily what's going to motivate the newer people or the kind of wider team. So yeah, that's a really important point. Does anyone have any comments from their reports? Anyone have any questions? Any traits they want to highlight? I'll take a drink of water. So I'm going to keep talking about these in a bit more detail about the positive and negative of them. But I've done a lot of that, so I'm going to go through these quickly. I just want to say again, these optimal bands, so those optimal bands are based on the traits of very senior leaders in multinational companies. So they're a very unique bunch, and they've got fairly narrow ranges. So these success metrics are based on a senior leadership position. But if we look at a sales position and what the ideal kind of candidate profile is for that, it's very different. So in sales, competitiveness is going to be way higher. Conscientiousness is often lower with salespeople because they tend to be more spontaneous and driven by what's going on right now instead of looking at long term. So sometimes it's more useful to have lower conscientiousness when you're looking at adapting to what's happening right now versus thinking about 5 or 10 year plans. Adjustment tends to be sometimes high with salespeople. Curiosity is often high. Any other examples that you can think of about profiles or jobs that would be very different than leadership? Have a different set of traits?
Like a financial analyst or something maybe?
Yeah, potentially. So what do you think would be different? What kind of traits would be different than leadership?
Like it's more, you're working with more black and white things versus all of the subjectivity.
Yeah, exactly. So that's going to come in with ambiguity, right? So you want someone in leadership who can listen to a lot of different ideas and opinions and figure out all of the different possibilities and then kind of distill that. But sometimes with a financial analyst, you need clarity. And creative accounting is not necessarily always a good thing in that sense. You might want more clarity and focus and directness in what the results say or what the analysis comes up with. So yeah, that's a really good example. Technical profiles tend to be really high conscientiousness, sometimes lower curiosity. So if you're looking at technicians who are really focused on a specific thing and solving a problem and can do it for ages and ages and ages, you might want some level of creativity or kind of curiosity that comes in there, but not the same necessarily as in other positions. Marketing, any guess for different marketing profiles? Conscientiousness, is it more long-term 5-10-year plan or dealing with what's happening right now? It depends. If you're looking at a marketing kind of leader or someone on the senior leadership team who focuses marketing, you might have more similar to leadership profiles, but kind of marketing people often have much lower conscientiousness and are much better at adapting to the immediate situation because you have an event that's happening right now and you need a communication plan now, this week, yesterday, instead of thinking how does this align with the company's kind of 10-year goals. But sometimes for that you might need high adjustment too, because you need to be able to deal with those constant stress and constant challenges and changes, and you've come up with a plan that all of a sudden has to go out the window because everything's changed that you base the assumptions on. So yeah, it depends on different positions within a leadership team. It also really depends on the different positions in the organization and the roles, what types of potential and what types of personality traits are useful. But that kind of order of conscientiousness and adjustment tend to be the most foundational, whereas something like competitiveness depends really, really much on the environment.
Can you just speak, Ian, before you leave that, just
Yep.
around like the range of what a score would be? Is it 0 to X, and then that sort of optimal, the moderate, optimal, and low, sort of that piece? Because you see, people are used to kind of like 0 to 100 or something. So just maybe tell us about the raw score so we don't think about it differently. Our minds often go to...
Yeah, that's a good point. And these are kind of, the scoring behind this is slightly different than just a standard 0 to 100. So these are based on a normal distribution, the bell curve, where most people cluster in the middle. So the majority of people, about 2/3 of people, have scores between about 40 and 60. And the reason for doing this is we're really interested in some of the more extreme and optimal ends of it and looking at what the kind of higher levels of score are and looking at the nuance there. So probably, 2/3 of people in this room probably have scores between 40 and 60 on most of these traits. That's not unusual, it's not good or bad, but that's generally how people tend to cluster in these ranges. And so we don't necessarily have the same number of people who are 1s and 2s as 40s and 50s. We'll have very few people who are under 10 or over 90, and that's just because we're looking at the most extreme ends of those traits and versus how those relate to performance. So that's done slightly differently than some tests, just because we want to look at the nuance in those optimal ranges. The optimal ranges also are based on the research, so they are based on senior leadership profiles. So those are the average for that leadership cohort. So these are the averages that kind of 2/3 of senior leaders would be within these optimal traits. So the kind of normal senior leadership profile for conscientiousness, the normal might be between 50 and 70. So you're just seeing that kind of shift in the average score of someone who's highly successful, highly effective in their role is that optimal trait. Yeah.
Just looking at the adjustment adjustment category, I guess it's called. I'm surprised, and is it across the majority of leaders that you've done this with that they score quite low for, I guess you would call it half stress tolerance? With the 38 on the adjustment category?
Oh, these scores are just a sample.
Oh, okay.
Sorry,
okay.
I should have said that.
Wow.
Yeah. No, they do have quite high adjustment, and these are based on Canadian leaders as well.
Okay.
So yeah, that 38 is an example, but those optimal ranges there, the darker band, is your optimal leadership profile. Yeah, so I'm glad you highlighted that actually, because that's an important point. So yeah, the kind of light gray area is the average range, and then the darker gray is the optimal range of leadership, because that would be very surprising. But it's funny because we've done some cross-cultural examinations of this, and these are based on regions as well as leaders. So we see European leaders have very similar profiles, but are slightly different. So Canadian and North American leaders tend to have higher adjustment than British leaders. It's a couple points, it's about 5 points difference. But when we're looking at really predicting potential at that level, that it's useful to get that kind of nuance in those averages, because sometimes there are slight cultural differences in how leaders operate and how they're expected to manage people and how they work with other people. And then there's obviously sometimes differences in hiring. There's not massive cross-cultural differences, especially between Europe and North America, because personality traits tend to be that foundational. So if these personality traits didn't work in different countries, they wouldn't be useful psychological concepts, because we're looking for stuff that is universally applicable to everyone, not just in a certain environment or certain workplace in a certain context. So I've got these, I'm going to talk through these really quickly because I've mostly talked about it, but I've got some slides about some of the advantages and disadvantages of both higher and lower ends of the spectrum. And I think that's useful to talk about, especially when we're looking at conscientiousness, because I think generally people tend to select for higher conscientiousness in organizations. It's not always the most desirable trait or attribute. It tends to be more related to long-term planning and performance, being highly disciplined and self-motivated. But there's also lots of jobs where being spontaneous, adaptable, easygoing, accommodating, being more focused on your immediate environment and what's going on right now can actually be really useful. The other thing is we find people with moderate traits tend to be a bit more adaptable and a bit more understanding of either end of the spectrum. So one of the challenges we have, especially with leaders, is people with really, really extreme traits tend not to understand people at all on the other end of the spectrum. So people who are really, really, really highly kind of type A personality, really focused, really driven, really aggressive, and really, really focused on workplace success, tend not to even understand sometimes people who are more relaxed about their work, have different priorities that aren't always 100% related to work performance. So some of the coaching and development work sometimes looks at that with leadership and understanding that these traits are hardwired, they're consistent, and there is really, really, really good value in having a diverse range of people who add different things to the team and having different people with different attributes who are better in different positions and bring that to the position. One of the things, this is a common example I've had in a couple of leadership teams, is someone who has really high conscientiousness but low ambiguity acceptance. And sometimes that's the person responsible for either finance or legal. And they're the person who is a bit annoying because they're not a strategic thinker, but they say, oh, we can't do that because it's illegal, or we can't do that because the regulator won't allow us to do it. And when people are having those blue sky conversations about here's ideally what our organization would love to do, it's a bit annoying to have someone to say, oh, no, you can't do that because you're going to get thrown in jail. But you need that person on the team because otherwise you get thrown in jail. So when we're looking at specific traits that are useful in different roles and understanding how to appreciate those and understand those on a leadership team and across the company, then it's good to have understand that those are useful in different positions. So there's also downsides to it. I'm going to talk about conscientiousness and the dark side, actually, because perfectionism can be a serious dark side trait if it's taken to extremes. So sometimes people who get really stressed but are highly conscientious tend to kind of veer into perfectionism and can waste time. And they get too detail-oriented, they get too focused on particular things that don't matter, they focus on things that they control when they need to focus on other things that actually need to be done. I have some experience of this personally. Focus on one goal can be too rigid, kind of too extreme, and to the exclusion of other things that do matter. So interestingly, when we see these high or low traits, especially the extremes of them, the dark side tends to come out most under times of stress or adversity. So things that can be really useful most of the time when things are going well, traits that are useful in most situations, when things get really, really difficult, can all of a sudden veer into being too much of a good thing, or too much of a good thing in the wrong situation, or the right situation.
Ian, last class we talked about when your strengths can go into overdrive,
Yeah.
like the balcony or the basement, and we talked about leaning into another strength. So maybe talk to us at some point about if you're too high in one, how do you moderate that piece? Like how do you manage that?
Yeah, this is a perfect one to talk about that actually, with adjustment. So again, like I was saying, higher adjustment is often an asset. Being more resilient to stress is often useful. Now the downside of that is people who are not very emotional and don't express their stress or their worry or anxiety can often be seen as cold or distant or difficult to communicate with. And they may be stressed about certain things, but other people might not see that. And one of the challenges that can be really challenging for leaders when your teams don't see you being a real person and don't think that they can come to you with a difficulty or something going wrong because they think that you don't experience stress at all. So having that kind of understanding about why other people might be more reactive to stress, might get a bit emotional at work, or specific things that might kind of trigger them or make them react to stress are really important to be able to understand how some people do find certain things more stressful, more difficult, more challenging. And there's all of those kind of defense mechanisms or support techniques or kind of support networks that if you have them, it can really boost people's resilience and help people manage stress if they know there is that support and that understanding to deal with it. Because if you're really, really stressed and also can't express it to someone else or can't tell someone else what's going wrong, that often makes it worse. So when we see leaders who have really, really high adjustment, sometimes really high adjustment and conscientiousness, they can be kind of cold and distant and seem like they're in a completely different world from most other people. Sometimes it's an image, sometimes it's projected because that's their extreme level of the trait, so that's what they're kind of comfortable with, and when things are really bad, they go more into that instead of kind of leaning onto the other end of it. So a lot of the development work, again, can be understanding what can trigger emotional reactions in other people, what really stresses people out, what people find really difficult. And I know in the last couple of years, over all of the stuff that's happened with COVID, I know some of the leaders that have been most successful, most effective, and kind of most empathetic have been the ones that can show that it is difficult and can kind of communicate what the plans are and what's happening, and that there's some realities of the world and the environment of the workplace that you do have to talk about and deal with and figure out how to manage. Because if you just pretend everything's okay, it's not okay for everyone. And if you don't talk about it and don't deal with it, then other people are going to derail because they don't have those ways of managing it and dealing with it and kind of confronting it. So adjustment is a good example of that, and having to be able to kind of moderate those traits. And even if you don't necessarily feel or react in the exact same way as other people, knowing that other people do react in that way, and it's part of their kind of personality and the core part of the way they process information. So if you're going to have a really effective team, you need to figure out how to manage that. So this, okay, kind of covered that. Curiosity and lower curiosity, we've mostly talked about that too. I think I'm going to skip ahead of these. If anyone has any specific questions about the traits, let me know and we can cover those. Higher ambiguity acceptance versus low ambiguity acceptance. We can see, the unstructured environments are really good for some people, really adaptive for some people, and some people absolutely need that structure. And it's something that if it's not provided for them, they're really going to struggle. I've worked with people like that who, if you give everyone their own task and say, okay, go work on something that's going to help the organization, some people will figure stuff out and some people are absolutely clueless. And it's not that they're clueless, it's that they just need that structure. And they need really clearly defined success metrics. So you say, this is what we're trying to achieve. This is an organization, this is what we're going to accomplish, and this is how we're going to measure it. And you could do X, Y, Z, and then all of a sudden they're off. They're amazing. But they need that clarity and structure, which some people, especially leaders sometimes who are in the strategic kind of ambiguous space of leadership, don't necessarily know. So you need to figure out how to adapt and moderate those kind of traits in relation to who you have. And sometimes if you've got people in technical specialist roles on the team, on the organization, on the board, then they're going to have a really different way of approaching information, and you need to see the value of that. Same with competitiveness, that too, because you can't have, sometimes this happens when people hire in their own image, and you get people hiring all the same personality profile. You get the hiring manager who hires 20 copies of himself, and they're all cutthroat, aggressive, competitive people, and that can cause real problems if every single person is striving to be the exact top person who gets the most recognition and most success, because they'll get the crap out of each other, emotionally, physically, psychologically, however. So understanding how to build teams that have some collaborativeness and lower competitiveness in roles that being a team player is useful is really, really important. So trait combinations, again, so these traits don't exist in isolation, as you've probably seen from your reports. They interact in interesting ways, and so when you're looking at profiles, you need to understand all of them. Because the temptation is, and sometimes people ask me, can you just get one score? Can you just say, on a scale of 0 to 100, who's the best person? And you can't do that. There's no real way to do that unless you have one single, very clear metric of success. Right? If you say, who's the fastest runner? You can say, okay, we're going to test that. That is one very simple, clear metric, and we can test that. But if you're saying who's going to be the best leader of a company, that is a big, broad, amorphous question. So you can say, here are some of the traits that are going to help us predict that. They're going to help us understand that, but we need to understand the kind of full range of personality traits and the combinations there. So are they highly conscientious, but have low adjustment or high adjustment? And how is that going to work in that workplace? So that kind of higher risk approach, higher adjustment is an interesting one, because this is one where people tend to have a really high resilience to stress, not bother too much about that stuff. But if higher risk approach, they really can be really confrontational. So that can be someone who doesn't worry too much about confrontation, discussion, solving problems. But if that veers too much into the kind of too much stress, too difficult, that's also the profile we'll a bully, of someone who has absolutely no anxiety about having an argument or a confrontation. But if they're not using it constructively and they don't understand the other people around them, then they might think that they're doing the right thing when they're absolutely not. So having those guardrails and those kind of developmental discussions is good too, to say, how do we manage performance? How do we manage different teams? And what is an appropriate way of doing that within that company? Because otherwise it can lead to problems. Lower ambiguity acceptance and higher conscientiousness is a combination that I find really interesting. I love working with these people sometimes because they're very direct, they're focused, and they get stuff done. But again, it depends on what the role is, what the team is, and what kind of the success criteria are. So that's not always the profile of a leader, but that can be the profile of a very successful, technician or someone who has a very clear task with very clear success or outcome criteria. Any combinations that anyone wants to bring up that they got in their profiles? Or hypothetical ones, you don't need to talk about your own. Yeah.
I just want to talk that my curiosity is high.
Yep.
Still over moderate. 60.
Okay.
And my ambiguity acceptance is low.
Okay.
It's 20.
Okay.
So how are the combinations of that,
Yeah, that's a good example.
would affect or impact or
Yeah, because that's that's high interest in novelty, but liking straightforward answers and clarity, right?
Yeah.
Like new information, but you want an answer. It's not just going back and doing a whole bunch of background research just because it's, okay, here's the best technique, here's the best tool. Is that right?
Yeah.
Yeah, so that's a really good example of that because it's about information and how you're processing information and what kind of stuff you like to know, but also about what the outcome is. So if there's an answer at the end, then that's really useful to know. And that's really good to know if I was working on a team with you, to know that I can't just waffle on for half an hour. You do want me to say something at the end of it. I hope I have. But yeah, exactly. So that's a really interesting combination. That's a perfect example. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Yeah. I think someone else. No? Yeah.
High adjustment and high risk approach will be the same.
Yeah.
Like I have optimal risk approach, but my adjustment is like 90.
Okay. Yeah. That's a very high score. So that's good. That's interesting because that's, again, probably able to confront challenges, difficulties, take personal professional risks, and do it without getting too anxious, right? Like some people would do that and it would be terrifying constantly. So knowing that, but then also knowing what might make other people kind of anxious in risk. So if you're doing group work, some people are going to find taking risks in a task or a project really, really difficult. It's really going to stress them out. You might be the good person to take the lead on that because you're like, I can do that. That's fun, right?
I have had people come up to me and say that you are not bothered about things and you don't do things
Yeah.
we want you to do, but kind of my mother sometimes called me motionless.
Yeah. Yeah, but that's a good example of it. And especially because I think with high adjustment too, we have to remember that everyone does have a few things. So even people who are really resilient to most kinds of stress do have some things that are really important, right? Some people who are resilient to any sort of stress at work, there might be family or relationship stuff that really does stress them out. There might be certain anxieties that you do have. So it's about the kind of value of different things and what you might worry about. So that can be sometimes challenging too, because people might think you're 100% of the time okay with anything, whereas there might be a few things where you're like, okay, this is going to be difficult, and kind of communicating that on the team too is useful in understanding how you talk about stress. And especially understanding people on opposite sides of the trait, because there's probably a few things that you can understand anxiety about, and then applying that to someone else who's anxious about a lot of things, think, okay, in this particular situation, this is something that I really don't like, but this is something that someone else might feel for something completely different. So kind of applying that experience can be really useful.
Thank you.
There's a hand. Myrah?
Hi, so if you create routines in an organization of people who have opposite scores,
Yeah.
how successful is that team generally, and do you see that often in organizations? Because I think a lot of people hire fit, so they want people who influence.
Yeah, and sometimes that happens. Cultural fit means a very specific profile or a set of traits or a set of skills. which is not always necessarily good. It depends what they're based on and whether it's evidence-based too, right? Because sometimes, I said before, it's about hiring someone in their own image. So the hiring manager wants 10 copies of them because they think their success is going to make everyone else successful. Not always true, but that's why doing some of that work about understanding what people bring to different roles is really good. So if you're saying, okay, this person who's in marketing or in finance or whatever has this set of traits that means they work differently, that makes them good in that job, right? You don't want to have necessarily the CEO doing every job. Sometimes they try to, but that causes problems. So kind of having those conversations about the values of people's different traits, as well as their different experiences and abilities bring to their team and their role is good, and understanding that that is advantageous because you can't have a company with carbon copies of the exact same person. It doesn't always work. It doesn't usually work.
Do you use this as a recruitment into companies, or is it more about coaching and development once they're in an organization?
Both. So it's sometimes when it's used for recruitment, that's when a company has a long-term talent pipeline. So we might say, okay, we're looking to find the 5 or 10% of people who also might be senior leaders. So you can use that for screening initially to say, okay, we're hiring, if your intake's 200 people, then we're going to look at, putting them in different positions, but also getting a sense of who might be the long-term high potential people for leadership or in a technical role or in different roles. I've seen this used as selecting senior leaders from kind of mid-level leaders. I did this once at an insurance company. We had 100 people from around the world, and they were all people who had been identified in their respective countries and organizations as high potential talent. So this was used along with a couple of other assessments to say, okay, who do we think we could select for the high potential leadership training program versus who needs more development or need more work in other areas. So you can use it in both ways. That's why those optimal profiles are really meant for development. But when you're looking at general personality traits, you can use it for screening for anything if you know it's going to predict success in that particular type of work. Yeah.
So is it more common, so for conscientiousness, would it be more common to find someone who has a pretty high score on that, having a lower score on their adjustment?
So they are slightly correlated. So the answer to that is yes, sometimes people who have high conscientiousness have slightly higher adjustment, but they're mostly independent. So they tend to trend a little bit in a similar direction, but not entirely. They can move a lot independently. So you commonly do see people who have high and low, high conscientiousness, low adjustment, and the reverse is also true.
And then I have one more quick question.
Okay.
So is it possible, are they all kind of like a give and take process with each other? Like, is it possible to have optimal in all of them?
It's possible. It's about 1 in kind of 10 to 50,000 that you see 6 out of 6 optimals. So because most of the traits, most people are between 40 and 60, it's really, really rare to see a whole bunch of 80s. It does happen. I've seen a couple. They're terrifying sometimes, but and the same is true of people who are really low in all of them. You do see it occasionally, but it's exceptionally rare. So it's unlikely to have 6 out of 6 on either side. They tend to cluster in the middle. But you do see all sorts of ranges. If I sampled 1 million people, I would probably get most combinations of scores.
We did a case study, Lunapads,
Yep.
2 ladies, and their MBTIs are the exact opposite.
Okay.
And they have 2 key traits that are high and the other 2 are low.
Yeah.
Right? So Madeline is very high in curiosity.
Yep.
And very low in conscientiousness, right? Those kind of things, because she's that creative visionary.
Yeah.
And so they were exact opposite MBTI, and their HPTI were quite interesting. 2 of them were quite opposite.
Okay, yeah.
Yeah, which I think was really interesting. Even though they're very successful, they don't score high on all of those.
Yeah, and if you're looking for different people who have different roles in the company, then you definitely want those people with the traits that match that. And sometimes, especially when you have a couple of founders who have identical profiles, sometimes people do find each other like that because they do have really similar ways of approaching problems, managing information, dealing with stress, but they're not always the best people to work together because they don't always see things from different perspectives. And especially when you're getting a bigger company and growing a company, you need people who can address different problems from different angles and manage them differently. I think I'm going to skip through the rest of this. We're almost to the dark side. So are there any more general questions about this before we move on? Yeah.
Just one regarding the scale. I know you talked about moderate, optimal, excessive being kind of what you've seen previously. Going forward, if I were to take this in 5-10 years, is that moderate, optimal, excessive, low scale going to be shifted depending on how we score and how everyone else you interview from
That's
now till then?
that's a really good question. Someone else had asked me. Okay, so yes, it potentially wouldn't change that much. I don't think it's likely to. I mean, the real question is, would we see a shift in what makes an optimal leader in the next 10 years? Potentially, maybe. I don't think it would shift a lot, and I don't think the population average would shift a lot. So these results are based on surveying tens of thousands of people at a variety of age ranges. So the age ranges are 18 to probably 80. So would the general personality profile of the population shift in the next 10 years? It's unlikely. We haven't seen major shifts in the last 50 years. If leadership fundamentally changed in a way, if what made a really high potential successful leader changed, then these might a little bit, but I think it's unlikely. The other thing we've done is we've done a lot of analysis across different groups, so between ages, genders, ethnicities, and we see as much variation in personality, so we're not looking at really significant gender differences. And that's actually a problem with some of the personality measures, is they have fundamentally different results based on gender, for example. And so if you're getting different results, then you're not necessarily that are biased based on just the gender versus the outcome measures of performance, then you don't always have a great measure because you're not predicting what you want to predict, and you're creating a kind of basic measurement bias that's creating problems in your outcomes. So yeah, that's a couple of good questions that I can't predict 100%, but that's why it's really important that we continue on doing the research, getting the data, and testing it out to make sure that this model of performance and potential isn't shifting, or if it does, we know, and it'll accommodate for that in score.